DeAndre Washington woke up that Wednesday morning to the oppressive silence of failure. No alarm, no notifications, no frantic messages from employers wondering where he was. For the first time in his 28 years, he had absolutely nowhere to be. The realization hit him like a physical blow as he stared at the water-stained ceiling of his cousin Terrell's cramped apartment in Liberty City, one of Miami's most economically challenged neighborhoods. The studio apartment was barely large enough for one person, let alone two grown men. Terrell had reluctantly offered DeAndre the couch 3 months ago after DeAndre's landlord changed the locks on his overtown efficiency. What was supposed to be temporary had become indefinite, and the tension between them grew thicker each day. DeAndre could feel his cousin's resentment in every heavy sigh, every pointed comment about groceries and utility bills. DeAndre dragged himself to the bathroom and confronted his reflection in the cracked mirror. Despite everything, he still looked good. 6 feet tall with an athletic build maintained through years of manual labor, deep brown skin, and sharp features that caught women's attention wherever he went. His hair needed a cut, twisted into short locks that were getting unruly, but barbershops cost money he didn't have. At least his appearance was still an asset, perhaps the only one he had left. The construction industry in South Florida had always been volatile, but DeAndre's recent streak of bad luck defied probability. His last job ended when the foreman caught him nursing a hangover on site. Before that, a commercial project collapsed due to financing issues. The job prior, he'd been fired for arguing with a supervisor who made one too many assumptions about his intelligence based on where he grew up. The pattern was clear. DeAndre was spiraling, and he couldn't seem to stop the descent. Growing up in Liberty City meant learning to hustle early. English and Haitian Creole mixed freely in the streets where DeAndre came of age, where everyone knew everyone's business and opportunities were scarce. He dropped out of Miami Northwestern High School at 17, chasing dreams that evaporated like morning fog. Now, more than a decade later, he was back where he started, sleeping on a borrowed couch with $14 to his name. That's when the dating apps had become more than just entertainment. It started innocently enough. Dinner dates with older women who appreciated his company and didn't mind paying. Then came the gifts. The cash slipped into his pocket with knowing smiles and whispered requests for discretion. By the time DeAndre realized he was essentially selling himself, he was too broke and too proud to care about the semantics. Miami's landscape of lonely, affluent women seemed endless. Divorced professionals in Coconut Grove, successful businesswomen in Brickell, tourists seeking local flavor in South Beach. DeAndre had developed a reputation in certain circles, passed along in hushed conversations over expensive lunches and rooftop cocktails. He was discreet, charming, and desperate enough to say yes to almost anything that came with a price tag. The apps made it easier and more dangerous simultaneously. No more awkward introductions through mutual acquaintances or chance meetings at bars he couldn't afford. Now it was just profiles, carefully worded messages, and arrangements made with clinical efficiency. DeAndre had rules: nobody under 45, always meet in public first, payment up front, no promises beyond a single night, and absolutely no emotional entanglement. He'd learned that last one the hard way after a sugar mama situation imploded when her ex-husband hired a private investigator. But rules were for people with options, and DeAndre's options were running out fast. Terrell had been dropping increasingly less subtle hints about finding somewhere else to stay. His car was one missed payment away from repossession. His phone service would be cut by Friday if he couldn't scrape together $200. So when the notification appeared on his screen that Wednesday morning, he didn't hesitate. The profile name was Marie D., 62 years old, and her main photo showed an elegantly dressed woman with salt and pepper hair styled in a sophisticated twist. She sat in what appeared to be an upscale restaurant, wearing a cream-colored blazer and gold jewelry that looked expensive even through a phone screen. Her smile was confident, composed, the expression of someone accustomed to getting what she wanted. The message was direct: visiting Miami on business and seeking sophisticated companionship for dinner tonight. Are you available? Compensation will be generous. DeAndre's pulse quickened. Business visitors usually meant serious money, and women who used words like sophisticated and compensation weren't playing games. He responded immediately, "Good morning. I'd love to join you for dinner. What did you have in mind?" Her reply came within minutes. "The Capitol Grill in Brickell at 8 o'clock. I'm staying at the Mandarin Oriental if you'd like to meet there first for drinks. I'm in the waterfront suite. $1,000 cash for the evening." DeAndre read the message 3 times to make sure he wasn't hallucinating. $1,000 was more than he'd made in the past 2 months combined. It was enough to pay Terrell, catch up on his car payments, and still have money left for food and gas. The Capitol Grill was one of Miami's most expensive steakhouses, where entrees started at $60. The Mandarin Oriental's waterfront suite probably cost more per night than he used to make in a good week. He was already mentally spending the money when a small voice in the back of his mind whispered a warning. Why would a wealthy woman visiting Miami pay $1,000 to have dinner with a stranger? What kind of business brought someone to the city with that kind of disposable income? And why specify the waterfront suite for pre-dinner drinks? But that voice was quickly drowned out by the louder, more insistent sound of his empty stomach and the notification on his phone that his credit card payment was overdue. DeAndre had been taking risks his entire life, from dropping out of school to follow a girl to Key West, to moving in with a drug dealer's girlfriend who swore she'd left that life behind. This was just another calculated gamble, and the potential payoff was too good to pass up. He typed his response. "The Mandarin Oriental sounds perfect. What time for drinks?" 7 o'clock. Ask for the waterfront suite at the front desk. My name is Marie Dessalines. Dress well. Marie Dessalines. The name sounded sophisticated, international. Probably a wealthy widow, maybe a successful businesswoman from New York or Atlanta. DeAndre had dealt with women like her before, women who'd made their fortunes and had no qualms about spending it on whatever made them feel young and desired again. He spent the rest of the day preparing with more care than he'd put into anything in months. He borrowed one of Terrell's best shirts, a crisp white button-down that was slightly tight across his shoulders, but emphasized his athletic build. His only decent pair of dress pants was wrinkled from being stuffed in a duffel bag, but a hot shower and some creative work with steam in the bathroom eliminated most of the creases. He found a black tie at the bottom of his closet, a relic from a cousin's wedding, and spent 20 minutes watching YouTube videos to remember how to tie it properly. At 6:30, DeAndre drove toward Brickell in his aging Honda Accord, the air conditioning struggling against Miami's humid evening heat. The radio played a mix of reggaeton and hip-hop, the soundtrack of his life in South Florida. He'd grown up with these sounds, learned to dance to these rhythms, kissed his first girlfriend to a song that now played on the oldies station. Crossing the Rickenbacker Causeway, Miami's skyline glittered before him like a promise. The sun was setting behind the downtown towers, painting the sky in shades of orange and pink that made the whole city look like a postcard. To his right, cruise ships lined the port of Miami like floating cities, ready to carry thousands of tourists to exotic destinations he'd never afford to see. The Mandarin Oriental rose before him like a monument to wealth, its sleek facade reflecting the dying light over Biscayne Bay. DeAndre had driven past it countless times, but never entered. It was the kind of place where valet parking cost more than his monthly phone bill, where the lobby bar served cocktails at $25 to people who tipped more in one night than he earned in a week. He pulled into the circular drive and immediately a valet in an immaculate uniform approached his car. DeAndre hesitated, knowing the tip alone would cost him his last $10, but there was no turning back now. He handed over the keys and walked through the massive glass doors into a world completely foreign to him. The lobby was all polished marble and contemporary art, with floor-to-ceiling windows offering unobstructed views of Biscayne Bay. Well-dressed guests moved through the space with the casual confidence of people who belonged there, their conversations a mixture of English, Spanish, and languages DeAndre couldn't identify. The air smelled of expensive cologne and fresh flowers, a stark contrast to the humid salt air outside. DeAndre approached the front desk, trying to project a confidence he didn't feel. "I'm here to see Marie Dessalines in the waterfront suite," he said. surprised at how steady his voice sounded. The concierge, a middle-aged man with impeccable grooming and a knowing smile, looked DeAndre up and down before nodding. "Of course, sir. The waterfront suite elevator is just past the main elevators, around the corner. Ms. Dessalines is expecting you." Walking toward the elevator, DeAndre caught his reflection in the mirrored walls. He had to admit he looked good. The borrowed shirt and tie gave him a sophisticated air that almost masked the desperation he felt inside. Almost. The waterfront suite elevator was smaller and more luxurious than the main ones, with rich wood paneling and soft lighting that made everything seem like a movie set. As it ascended to the top floor, DeAndre felt a flutter in his stomach, a mixture of excitement and anxiety. In less than an hour, he'd be $1,000 richer, or he'd be dealing with whatever complications arose from getting involved with a woman he knew nothing about. The elevator doors opened directly into the suite's foyer, and DeAndre stepped into a space that redefined his understanding of luxury. Floor-to-ceiling windows offered a panoramic view of Biscayne Bay and the Atlantic Ocean beyond. The furniture was modern and expensive, with clean lines and rich fabrics that probably cost more than his car. Fresh orchids adorned every table, and the air carried a light scent of jasmine. "You must be DeAndre," said a voice behind him, and he turned to see Marie Dessalines for the first time in person. She was even more striking than her photograph, with high cheekbones and pale green eyes that seemed to look right through him. Her salt and pepper hair was styled in loose waves that perfectly framed her face, and she wore a flowing black dress that managed to be both elegant and timeless. Diamond earrings caught the light as she moved, and her smile was warm but contained an edge he couldn't quite identify. "Ms. Dessalines," DeAndre said, extending his hand. "Thank you for inviting me. This is incredible." He gestured at the view, genuinely impressed despite himself. "Marie, please," she said, taking his hand in both of hers. Her skin was soft but cool, and she held the contact a moment longer than necessary. "And yes, I love this view. There's something special about being above it all, don't you think? It gives you perspective." Her accent was subtle but definitely present, Caribbean roots mixed with something else he couldn't place. She moved toward a well-stocked bar in the corner with movements that were graceful and deliberate. "What would you like to drink? I have excellent Haitian rum, or perhaps something more tropical. After all, we're in Miami." "The rum sounds perfect," DeAndre replied, watching as she poured generous measures into crystal glasses. She handed him one, and their fingers brushed again. He noticed she wore no wedding ring, only a large emerald on her right hand that looked antique and expensive. "To new experiences," Marie said, raising her glass. "To new experiences," DeAndre repeated, though something in her tone made the words feel heavier than they should. As they talked, DeAndre found himself relaxing despite his initial nervousness. Marie was intelligent and well-traveled, sharing stories about business in Port-au-Prince and art galleries in New York. She asked about his life in Miami and seemed genuinely interested in his childhood in Liberty City and his complicated relationship with the city that had shaped him. "You know," she said, after finishing their second round of drinks, "I think we should skip dinner at the Capitol Grill tonight. I'm finding myself much more interested in staying here and getting to know you better. Would that be acceptable?" The question hung in the air between them, loaded with implications. DeAndre looked into her pale green eyes and felt something shift in the room, a subtle change in pressure that made his skin tingle. Outside, Miami's skyline had come alive with lights, and the city had transformed into a brilliant constellation of possibilities and dangers. "That sounds perfect to me," he heard himself say, though a small voice in the back of his mind was screaming warnings he chose to ignore. Marie smiled, and for an instant, DeAndre could have sworn her eyes gleamed with something predatory. But then she reached out, touched his arm, and all rational thought dissolved into the warm Florida night and the promise of easy money that had brought him to this moment. Marie led DeAndre deeper into the suite, past the main living area toward a more intimate corner near the floor-to-ceiling windows. Miami's skyline stretched infinitely before them, a tapestry of lights that seemed to pulse with the city's rhythm. She gestured for him to sit on a plush velvet sofa, while she moved to what appeared to be a small bar tucked into a corner. "I have something special I'd like you to try," Marie said, her back to him as she manipulated bottles and glasses. "It's a family recipe from my grandmother's time in Haiti. She used to say it brought people closer together." DeAndre settled into the sofa, feeling the expensive fabric beneath his hands. Everything in the suite breathed wealth and refinement, from the original artwork on the walls to the fresh orchids that seemed to occupy every room. Through the massive windows, he could see the lights of Key Biscayne, the hotels and condos glowing like jewels along the coast. "Where in Haiti is your family from?" he asked, genuinely curious. Marie's accent was subtle but suggested deep roots somewhere in the Caribbean. "Port-au-Prince originally," she replied, though something in her tone suggested the answer was more complicated. "My grandmother came from a very old family. She taught me many things about traditional remedies and practices." She returned with a tray holding 2 crystal glasses filled with a deep red liquid that looked almost black in the ambient lighting. The glasses were exquisite, cut crystal that refracted the city lights into tiny rainbows. Marie sat beside him on the sofa, closer than before, and DeAndre caught the scent of her perfume, something exotic and floral that reminded him of jasmine mixed with something earthier he couldn't identify. "What is it?" DeAndre asked, accepting the glass. The liquid had an unusual consistency, slightly thicker than wine, and gave off a sweet metallic aroma. "Sang de vie," Marie said with a smile. "Blood of life. Don't worry, it's just an old name for a blend of herbs and fruits. My grandmother swore it enhanced connection between people." DeAndre brought the glass to his lips, hesitating for just a moment. There was something about the drink he didn't like, though he couldn't say exactly what. But Marie was watching him with those pale green eyes, her expression so expectant that refusing seemed impossible. The liquid hit his tongue with an explosion of flavors unlike anything he'd experienced. At first it was sweet, like pomegranate or cherry, but underneath were tastes he couldn't identify, herbs that seemed to tingle on his tongue, spices that warmed his throat as he swallowed. Almost immediately he felt a wave of heat spreading through his chest and limbs. "This is incredible," he said, his voice sounding different, deeper, and more resonant. "I've never tasted anything like it." Marie smiled and took a sip from her own glass, though DeAndre noticed she barely wet her lips before setting it aside. "My grandmother used to say some recipes are too powerful to consume frequently. You have to savor them, enjoy them completely." As they talked, DeAndre felt increasingly relaxed, almost euphoric. The city lights seemed brighter, more vivid, and Marie's voice took on an almost musical quality. When she reached over to touch his hand, her fingers sent an electric sensation across his skin. "Tell me your dreams, DeAndre," she said, her voice dropping to almost a whisper. "What do you desire most in this world?" The question seemed profound in his altered state, and DeAndre found himself speaking with unusual honesty. "I want to matter," he heard himself say. "I want to be more than just another guy from Liberty City trying to make rent. I want to leave something behind, you know, be remembered." Marie's eyes seemed to glow in the dim light. Memory is a powerful thing. Some people remain alive in ways they never imagined. She moved closer, sliding her hand up his arm, and DeAndre felt his pulse accelerate. The drink continued its work, intensifying every sensation. When Marie leaned in to kiss him, it was like touching a live wire. What followed became a dreamlike sequence that DeAndre would struggle to reconstruct later. Marie led him to the master bedroom, a space dominated by an enormous bed and more floor-to-ceiling windows, offering an unobstructed view of the Atlantic Ocean. Candles appeared from somewhere, dozens of them filling the room with flickering light and the scent of something that wasn't quite jasmine. Marie moved with a confidence that was both seductive and slightly unsettling. There was nothing hesitant or self-conscious about her despite her age. If anything, she seemed to come more alive as the night progressed, her skin taking on an almost luminous quality in the candlelight. As they made love, DeAndre felt he was experiencing something beyond the purely physical. The drink Marie had given him seemed to intensify all sensations, making his skin hypersensitive to her touch. Time became fluid, moments stretching into hours, or perhaps hours compressing into moments. At some point, he realized Marie was whispering words he didn't understand, phrases that might have been Haitian Creole but sounded older, more archaic. The candles flickered in patterns that seemed almost choreographed, and DeAndre found himself caught in rhythms that felt primitive, ancestral. Marie's hands guided him with surprising strength, and her whispered words took on the cadence of an incantation. The room seemed to pulse with energy, and Miami's skyline beyond the windows became a blur of light and shadow. Throughout it all, DeAndre felt as if something was being taken from him, as if some essential part of himself was flowing into Marie with each breath, each heartbeat, each moment of connection. It wasn't unpleasant, quite the opposite, but it left him feeling simultaneously energized and utterly exhausted. The last thing he remembered clearly was Marie's face above him in the candlelight, her features seeming to shift and transform, becoming younger and more vibrant as shadows danced across the walls like living things. Then, exhaustion claimed him, pulling him into the deepest sleep he'd ever experienced. When DeAndre woke, the first thing he noticed was the silence. The suite, which had been alive with subtle sounds of luxury throughout the night, the whisper of air conditioning, the distant hum of the city, now seemed completely dead. Even the ever-present sound of Miami traffic seemed muffled and far away. The second thing he noticed was the cold. Despite the warm Florida night, his skin was clammy and his muscles ached as if he'd run a marathon. The sheets beneath him were soaked with sweat that had already begun to cool. "Marie," he called out, his voice cracking. No response echoed through the darkened suite. DeAndre tried to sit up and immediately regretted it as the room spun violently. His head pounded with a pain that seemed to originate deep behind his eyes. The bedroom looked different in the pale dawn light filtering through the massive windows. The candles had vanished, along with their lingering scent. The space seemed sterile, unused, as if no one had been there for days. Forcing himself to stand, DeAndre stumbled toward the bathroom, his legs unsteady. Under the harsh fluorescent lighting, his reflection shocked him. His face was pale, almost gray, and his eyes were sunken with dark circles that made him look years older. But when he looked down, real panic set in. Something was terribly wrong. The skin around his groin was discolored, with red patches mixing with areas that looked almost gray. A burning sensation made him double over, gasping. The smell that had been bothering him since he woke definitely came from his own body, a sour, organic odor that turned his stomach. "Marie!" he shouted, his voice echoing in the empty suite. But even as he called for her, DeAndre knew she was gone. The silence was too absolute, too final. Staggering back to the main room, he searched for any trace of the woman who'd brought him here. The bar where she'd prepared the drinks showed no signs of recent use. The sofa where they'd sat was perfectly arranged, the cushions fluffed as if no one had touched them. Even the crystal glasses had disappeared, leaving no trace of the strange red liquid that had started everything. DeAndre's hands shook as he searched for his clothes scattered across the bedroom floor. Dressing was agony, each movement sending new waves of pain through his body. His phone showed 17 missed calls from Terrell and a series of increasingly worried text messages. As dawn broke over Miami, DeAndre made his way unsteadily toward the elevator, leaving behind a suite that appeared to have been professionally cleaned and reset. The concierge who'd greeted him the night before was nowhere to be seen, replaced by another man who barely looked up as DeAndre passed. Outside, his Honda Accord sat alone in the valet area, keys on the front seat, with no attendant in sight. As he drove slowly through empty streets toward Liberty City, DeAndre tried to make sense of what had happened to him. But with each passing mile, the events of the previous night seemed less real, more like a feverish dream that had left him hollow and confused. By the time he reached Terrell's apartment, a terrible certainty had crystallized in his mind. Whatever Marie Dessalines had done to him, it was far from over. DeAndre barely made it up the concrete steps of Terrell's building before his legs buckled. He collapsed against the rusty metal railing, gasping for air as waves of nausea washed over him. The Miami morning heat was already intensifying, but his skin felt cold and clammy despite the rising temperature. The Liberty City apartment complex was a far cry from the Mandarin Oriental's luxury, built in the 1970s and showing every one of its years in peeling paint, cracked sidewalks, and air conditioning units that rattled and wheezed in their mounts. The parking lot was already filling with cars belonging to people heading to early shifts at the airport, the port, or the countless service jobs that kept South Florida running. Terrell's apartment was on the second floor, and each step up the exterior staircase felt like climbing a mountain. DeAndre fumbled for his key with hands shaking so badly it took 3 attempts to unlock the door. Inside, the apartment was dark and quiet. Terrell worked night shifts at Miami International Airport, loading baggage for American Airlines, which meant he'd be home in less than an hour. DeAndre stumbled toward the bathroom, desperate to examine what his body was telling him was catastrophically wrong. Under the harsh fluorescent light, what he saw made his knees buckle. The discoloration had spread, creeping up his lower abdomen in tendrils that looked almost black against his brown skin. The smell was definitely coming from him, a putrid organic stench that made him gag. "God help me," he whispered, slipping into the religious phrases he'd heard his grandmother use in moments of crisis, though he hadn't been to church since she died 5 years ago. He tried to remember details of the previous night, but everything after Marie's strange drink remained frustratingly unclear. He remembered her hands on him, her whispered words in that language he couldn't identify, the sensation of something being pulled from deep within him. But the specifics dissolved like smoke whenever he tried to focus on them. The pain was intensifying, a burning sensation radiating from his groin into his lower abdomen. DeAndre turned on the sink faucet and splashed cold water on his face, trying to clear his mind enough to think rationally. He needed medical attention, that much was obvious, but the thought of explaining this situation to a doctor in a hospital filled him with dread. The front door opened with its familiar creak, and DeAndre heard Terrell's heavy footsteps crossing the living room. His cousin had a physically demanding job, and at 34 was beginning to show the wear. But Terrell had always looked out for DeAndre since they were kids growing up in the same neighborhood, where English and Haitian Creole mixed freely, and everyone knew everyone's business. "DeAndre," Terrell called out in English, his usual morning greeting. "Your car's outside, but you didn't answer your phone last night." DeAndre opened the bathroom door, trying to compose himself. Terrell took one look at his face, and his expression immediately shifted from annoyance to concern. "Jesus, man, you look terrible. What happened to you?" "I think I need to go to the hospital," DeAndre said, his voice barely above a whisper. "Something's really wrong, Terrell. Really wrong." Terrell asked no questions, which DeAndre appreciated. Within minutes, they were in Terrell's battered Ford pickup, cutting through morning traffic toward Jackson Memorial Hospital. The public hospital served much of Miami's uninsured population, and DeAndre had been there before for various injuries from construction jobs. The emergency room was already crowded despite the early hour. Miami's population of shift workers, tourists, and people living on society's margins meant Jackson Memorial never really slept. They took a number and sat in plastic chairs that had seen better decades, surrounded by the familiar sounds of multiple languages and the smell of disinfectant that all hospitals seem to share. "You want to tell me what happened?" Terrell asked quietly, keeping his voice low in the packed waiting room. DeAndre looked at the other patients, a construction worker with a bandaged hand, an elderly Haitian woman clutching her purse and speaking rapid Creole to her daughter, a young mother trying to calm her feverish toddler. These were his people, Miami's working-class families who couldn't afford private doctors or expensive insurance. "Last night I met someone," he began carefully. "A woman staying at the Mandarin Oriental. Said she was here on business. She paid me to—" He trailed off, unable to finish the sentence. Terrell nodded without judgment. He knew about DeAndre's occasional arrangements with wealthy women. He'd even warned him it was dangerous territory. "She gave me something to drink, said it was a family recipe. After that, everything gets fuzzy. But when I woke up this morning, she was gone, and DeAndre gestured helplessly at his body. "Look at me, Terrell. I look like I aged 10 years overnight. It was true. Under the harsh waiting room lights, DeAndre appeared gaunt and pale. No trace of his usual vitality. Dark circles ringed his eyes, and his skin had taken on a sickly, ashen tone that made him look seriously ill. "DeAndre Washington?" called a nurse, mispronouncing his last name in a way that had irritated him since elementary school. The examination room was small and sterile, with medical equipment that looked like it had been state-of-the-art sometime in the 1990s. Dr. Sarah Chen was a young resident who looked like she'd been working 36-hour shifts, which was probably the case. Jackson Memorial was notorious for burning out its residents. "What brings you in today?" she asked, consulting her clipboard. DeAndre explained his symptoms as clinically as possible, omitting the stranger details about Marie and focusing on the physical reality of his condition. Dr. Chen's expression grew increasingly concerned as she examined him. "Have you been exposed to any chemicals recently? Any new medications or recreational drugs?" she asked. "Nothing like that," DeAndre replied. "Just the drink I mentioned." "I'm going to need to run some blood tests," Dr. Chen said. "What you're describing doesn't match any STD or infection pattern I'm familiar with. The tissue damage is unusual." She drew several vials of blood, each one disturbingly dark under the fluorescent light. "I want you to stay here while we run these tests. If this is some kind of poisoning, we need to identify it quickly." Hours passed in the sterile examination room. Terrell brought coffee and sandwiches from the hospital cafeteria, though DeAndre had no appetite. The pain kept getting worse, and he noticed the discoloration spreading, climbing up his abdomen in tendrils that looked almost black beneath his brown skin. When Dr. Chen returned, her expression was grim. "I've never seen blood work like this," she admitted. "Your white blood cell count is through the roof, but we can't identify any bacteria or virus causing the infection. Your tissue is necrotizing at a rate that defies medical explanation." "Necrotizing," DeAndre repeated, though he already feared what the word meant. "Dying," Dr. Chen said bluntly. "Your tissue is dying from the inside out, and we don't know why. I'm admitting you for observation and starting broad-spectrum antibiotics, but honestly, I'm not sure they'll help." As they prepared to move him to a room upstairs, DeAndre caught his reflection in the bathroom mirror. The change in just hours was shocking. His face was more gaunt, his skin grayer, and his eyes had taken on a sunken appearance that made him look like a completely different person. "Terrell," he said as his cousin prepared to leave. "That woman, Marie Dessalines. If something happens to me, you have to find her. Promise me." Terrell squeezed his hand tightly. "Nothing's going to happen to you, man. The doctors will figure it out." But as DeAndre lay in the narrow hospital bed that night, listening to the sounds of the city beyond his window, he knew what was happening to him was beyond modern medicine's reach. Marie had done something to him, taken something from him, and with each passing hour it became clearer that she'd never intended for him to survive their encounter. DeAndre Washington died on a Friday morning at 3:42 a.m., while Miami slept under a blanket of humidity and darkness. The monitors in his isolation room at Jackson Memorial flatlined with mechanical precision, recording the end of a life that had been systematically drained over 5 agonizing days. Terrell was dozing in a hallway chair when nurses rushed in, but there was nothing left to save. Detective Lisa Rodriguez arrived at the hospital as the sun rose over Biscayne Bay, painting the sky in shades of orange and pink that seemed obscene against the tragedy unfolding inside those sterile walls. She'd been with Miami-Dade police for 14 years and had seen plenty of strange cases. But the call from Jackson Memorial that Friday morning caught her attention like few others. A young man in his 20s was dying from rapid tissue necrosis with no apparent cause, and the attending physician suspected foul play. Dr. Chen met her in the lobby, looking exhausted and frustrated. "I've been practicing medicine for 6 years and never seen a case like this. The patient's tissue necrotized at an inexplicable rate, and every test we ran came back negative for known toxins or pathogens." They walked through hospital corridors toward the 4th floor. "Tell me about the patient," Rodriguez said. DeAndre Washington, 28 years old, construction worker from Liberty City, came in Wednesday morning with symptoms that initially suggested some kind of infection, but the progression didn't match anything in medical literature. Dr. Chen had warned her about the smell and appearance, but Rodriguez still wasn't prepared. Even from across the now empty room, she could detect the sour, organic odor. What struck her most was how old DeAndre looked for his age, as if he'd aged decades in less than a week. After leaving the hospital, Rodriguez began her investigation. She started at the Mandarin Oriental, where the night manager remembered DeAndre clearly. A handsome young man, well-dressed, asked for Ms. Dessalines in the waterfront suite. And Ms. Dessalines? Older woman, elegant, salt and pepper hair, very sophisticated. She'd been staying with us for a week. Paid everything in cash, very private. Rodriguez's investigator instincts sharpened. Cash for a waterfront suite, very unusual. Paid the full amount up front in $100 bills, said she preferred privacy. Back at the station, Rodriguez began searching for information on Marie Dessalines. No Florida driver's license, no social security number matching her age and description, no credit card records or hotel registrations anywhere in Miami-Dade. Marie Dessalines was a ghost, existing only in DeAndre Washington's memory and a hotel manager's testimony. That evening, Rodriguez sat in her apartment studying DeAndre's case file and the medical reports that made no sense. She had her laptop open to multiple databases, searching for similar cases. What she found made her stomach turn. Over the past 9 years, 3 other young men in their 20s had died in South Florida hospitals from unexplained tissue necrosis, all healthy before falling ill. All seen with older women shortly before getting sick. In all cases, the women had vanished without a trace. Marcus Chen in 2016 found dead in his Coral Gables apartment. Stephen Torres in 2019 died at Mount Sinai Medical Center from organ failure. James Peterson last year died at Baptist Hospital while doctors struggled to understand his condition. Rodriguez pulled the case files. All investigations had closed due to lack of evidence, classified as unexplained medical cases. But every detective had hit the same wall. Victims had met mysterious older women who disappeared like smoke. She consulted Dr. William Hayes, the county medical examiner, who remembered these cases vividly. The necrosis patterns were identical, too rapid and too organized. It followed specific pathways that suggested intentional attack rather than random infection. Dr. Hayes recommended Professor Maria Santos, a University of Miami anthropologist specializing in Caribbean folk practices. When Rodriguez explained her investigation, the professor's expression turned grave. "You're describing very old, very dangerous practices. In Caribbean traditions, Santeria, voodoo, there are rituals involving the transfer of life force from one person to another. Practitioners use stolen energy to maintain youth and prolong life far beyond natural limits. They move frequently, adopt new identities. Do you believe these practices actually work?" "Detective, I've spent 30 years studying these traditions. I've seen things Western medicine cannot explain. Whether supernatural or advanced plant chemistry, the effects are real." As Professor Santos spoke, Rodriguez understood she wasn't investigating an isolated incident. She was looking at a pattern stretching back years. A predator moving through South Florida communities, selecting victims and vanishing like smoke. That night, Rodriguez received a call from Miami Beach police. A 26-year-old personal trainer named Carlos Ruiz had reported a suspicious approach from an older woman on a dating app, offering $2,000 for dinner. The woman called herself Isabel Martin, claiming to stay at the Four Seasons. Rodriguez rushed to set up surveillance, but when they checked, no Isabel Martin was registered. Marie had disappeared again, leaving behind another near victim and the growing certainty that she was always one step ahead. Standing on Miami Beach that night, listening to Atlantic waves break against the sand, Rodriguez made a decision. This case wouldn't close, wouldn't be filed away as another unsolved mystery. She'd keep investigating, learning, building the file until she found a way to stop the woman who fed on Miami's young men like a parasite feeding on the city's vitality. Somewhere in Miami's vast urban landscape, Marie Dessalines was already selecting her next victim, scrolling through profiles and crafting messages designed to lure another young man to his death. The cycle would continue because Rodriguez didn't yet know how to break it with conventional police tools. But the hunt had begun, and Detective Lisa Rodriguez wasn't giving up.